I just want to thank the folks who were involved in organizing this. It's a great idea. It's a great opportunity for us to talk about things that, you know, as educators actually affect us. One of the things that I always have tried to get across to pre-service teachers when I did honest work and taught in teacher preparation before I went to the dean's office was that they are policymakers. Right? In fact, all of us who are involved in education are policymakers. So whatever people decide in Raleigh or DC, at the district, school, classroom level, those of us who are educators are interpreting that and making decisions about what we're going to do on the basis of it. So as we have this conversation, you might want to keep that in mind. It's not just folks in Raleigh who are making policy. We're making policy through everything that we do. The other thing that I was going to mention was that, again, as we talk about this, when I think about people in the assembly, I think about lawmakers in general. I always think back to Herb Simon's motion about satisficing. He used this term to convey that when anyone in a policy position is forced to make a decision, they do so in a way that I don't know how to put this, that ticks off as few people as possible, right? So the idea that we would optimize through our decisions, Herb always said, is a crazy notion. That we can't optimize because, A, we don't know the consequences of the decisions we make. We think we make a decision and it's a good decision, and then the law of unintended consequences kicks in, and it turns out to be not the decision that we thought we were making. And we make it on the basis of incomplete information. And we make it on the basis of our often weak memories of what's gone before. So those are just some things to keep in mind as we have this conversation. I'll turn things over to Chris. He'll introduce the panel. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Dean. My name is Chris. I'd like to welcome everybody on behalf of the host of graduate students who have been working very hard over the last week or so to put this together. Just wanted to kind of orient everybody to the session and how we're going to proceed today. This is the agenda that we've laid out. First, kind of want to set the context and frame out the discussion. Talk a bit about some of the legislation that is currently moving its way through the legislature, and then we'd like to ask questions to the panel about it. Then we'll move on to a panel discussion that will last for about half an hour, and then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for question and answers from the audience. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit, one of the things that we were all thinking about as a group is why are we having this conversation now, right? So education is a high impact field for policy. Changes happen all the time. But it strikes us that right now is a particularly historic moment for North Carolina. I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but this is the first time that the legislature in the state has changed party hands in almost 120 years. The last time was back in the 1890s. The governor's seat has changed hands for the first time in almost 20 years. So we have, in the words of John Kingdon, Frank Baumgartner, who is here, kind of a moment where policy windows are opening and the equilibrium of policy in North Carolina is definitely being punctuated. So it's a moment of great change for a variety of policy systems across the state. Right? So we're seeing bills go through to change the way that we vote, that are changing the way that we pay taxes potentially. And in schools, we're looking at systems or policies that are moving through to change the way that local schools are funded, the ways that we spend taxpayer money. That will change the way that we approve charter schools and who can introduce charters. That will change the way that teachers are paid and hired and fired. So we feel like it's important for the campus community and the wider community here in North Carolina to be informed about what's happening, to be paying attention, and to know what's going on. So that's why we put this together. So next up, I'd like to introduce Ariel, who's going to share with you some information about our panelists, and then we'll move on to talking about the bills in specific that we'd like to bring to the discussion.
Right, so we are very lucky today to have a panel of experts in the fields of education and education policy and politics to talk about the implications of the bills that are right now being put forth in the General Assembly of North Carolina. So beginning, right next to me, we have Dr. Catherine Marshall. She's a professor of education leadership and policy at UNC Chapel Hill. She has authored and edited numerous books on topics related to educational politics, leadership for social justice, feminist critical policy analysis, and activist educators. She has been nationally recognized for her work in the areas of feminism, social justice, and education politics. She researches and teaches on issues centered on the politics of education, gender policy, and social justice leadership. Dr. Sloan Vogel is an associate professor of policy and education reform at UNC Chapel Hill and is the coordinator of the Policy Leadership and School Improvement PhD program. She's currently a co-principal investigator and associate director of the National Center for Scaling of Effective Schools. Her teaching and research focus on the political antecedents of school reforms and the governance structures that facilitate education policy adoption, implementation, and effectiveness. Dr. Charles Cobble is a professor emeritus of science education at ECU. He was dean of the ECU School of Education for 13 years. For 6 years, he was the vice president of the University of North Carolina and the vice president of policy studies and programs at the Education Commission of the States in Denver, Colorado for 3 years. In addition, he co-founded 2 companies, the Third Mile and Teacher Preparation Analytics. And Dr. Cobble is also a triple alum of UNC, having received his bachelor's, master's, and doctorate in curriculum and instruction from Chapel Hill. Edward Fisk is former education editor of the New York Times, the author of Smart Schools, Smart Kids, Why Some Schools Work, The Fifth Guide to Colleges, and other numerous books on college admissions. He has written extensively on global education issues and is a member of the board of the North Carolina Center for International Understanding and Citizen Schools, North Carolina. He and his wife, Dr. Helen Ladd, professor of public policy at Duke University, recently authored the State Board of Education's new vision statement for the future of public education in North Carolina. And finally, Dr. Eric Halp is an associate professor of education leadership and policy at UNC Chapel Hill and is a Keenan faculty fellow and the coordinator of the Education Leadership EDD program. Dr. Halp has extensive involvement working with public schools, school districts, and state education policy initiatives. His research centers on state funding, formulas, school finance policies, school district efficiency, student assignment, and teacher quality. So now, before our panelists weigh in on the bills, we have a few more students who are going to be introducing what these bills are and explaining what's in them. So Danielle and Allison are going to explain them.
Good afternoon.
Hi, I'm Allison, and this is Danielle. And so there are many bills right now in the General Assembly making their way through. And we only have an hour. So we're not going to talk about all of them. We're focusing our attention on these, I guess these are 5 or 6 bills. You have a handout, or most of you should, that gives you more information about the specifics of the bills. And if you're interested in looking at the exact language in these bills, you can now or later go to this website, ncleg.net, and in the top right, you can put in the name or the number of the bill and pull it up and look at the most recent version in the legislature. Instead of talking specifically about each bill, Danielle and I are going to talk more broadly about some of the changes that these bills seek to make.
Okay, so we structured our few minutes around overall themes, right? So there's a bill, is it Senate 218, called No Post-Secondary Education / Illegal Aliens. So basically the bill is aimed at prohibiting undocumented citizens from being allowed to take courses or enroll in any 2- or 4-year institution in North Carolina. This goes a bit further than previous federal legislation that maybe doesn't allow undocumented citizens to get like federal financial aid or things of that nature. But this bill actually says that even if these students have their own funding, under no circumstances would they be allowed to attend a 4- or 2-year institution in North Carolina. It does exempt high school students who are currently like dually enrolled. Maybe they're taking college courses at a community college or a 4-year institution, so they are exempted. And then also students who are already in programs, so for example, undocumented students who are already here at Carolina, they would still be allowed to finish their programs or continue taking classes. There's also a bill that would like to eliminate personalized education plans, or PEPs. I know we have a lot of teachers and educators in the room, so you probably know, but for those of us who are unaware, a PEP is basically a written plan aimed at helping students who may be struggling, right? So maybe they have low test scores, or for whatever reason, a teacher feels that they're not progressing towards promotion to the next grade or to graduation. And so they can then get a PEP, which would basically lay out a plan for them for how they can be successful. So it would identify initiatives and things to help them succeed to the next grade or to graduation. And this, there's also legislation that aims to cut services for children with exceptional needs. So there is a commission being created. And the job of the commission is to look for places where what the services that the state is providing for children with exceptional needs, look for places where what we are doing is greater than what the federal government requires us to do. And then to make recommendations that those programs be cut so that we are not doing more than we're required to. Okay, so in terms of current and future teachers, there is a bill that would like to eliminate the career status designation, and that's basically the tenure, the term for tenure. And so if you have tenure at this point, my understanding is that you would still be included in this, which no longer grants tenure, but instead says if you have been teaching for fewer than 3 years, you can get a contract of 1 year, so a yearly contract. If you've been teaching longer than that, then you can get a contract of 1 to 4 years. There's also a bill that would like to eliminate the class size cap and maximum teaching load for teachers. I do want to emphasize that the House version of the bill only eliminates the class size cap for K through 3, but the Senate version of the bill does not discriminate, right? So they would like to erase the class size limits on classes, as well as, I believe right now the limit is 150 kids per day that teachers can teach. They would like to lift that limit as well. And then they also would like to implement a performance pay system. The language in the bill is still fairly vague, but they are saying that whenever there is a robust instrument that is created that can evaluate teachers, they plan for that bill to be, or for that instrument rather, to be used to pay teachers for their performance. Now Allison is going to finish with the rest of this 20 minutes.
So the Excellent Schools Act of 2013 also mentions raising the minimum SAT and ACT scores for entry into teacher education programs. I believe it raises it to 1,100 on the SAT and 24 on the ACT. And one of the bigger changes is that this bill would require teacher education programs as well as master's programs, so the MAT, MED, MSA programs, to submit annual performance reports to the State Board of Education. So these reports would include things like the average GPA of the students in the program, graduation and time of graduation rates, average scores on professional and content area exams, percentage of students who are hired as teachers and then remain in teaching for 4 or more years, employer satisfaction based on a survey. And the bill says that the State Board of Education would be able to reward and sanction teacher education programs based on these annual performance reports. The legislation that's moving right now through the General Assembly also seeks to alter the way that schools are financed and monitored in the state. And one of the biggest changes would be the creation of a new charter school board. And this board would operate independently of the Department of Public Instruction, DPI, and the State Board of Education, although DPI is required under the bill to provide office space to the board. And so the way that it currently works in North Carolina is that an individual, a group of individuals, or a nonprofit can apply for a charter. And they would submit their application to one of several charter authorizing entities, so local school boards, the Board of Trustees of the UNC system, and the State Board of Education. And if this bill were passed, several changes would take place. Only nonprofits would be able to apply for charter schools, no longer individuals or groups of individuals, and the only charter authorizing entity would be this new charter board. No longer would local boards of education or the State Board of Education be able to authorize charter schools. Also, the board that would make these decisions is made up of appointed members appointed by the governor and the General Assembly. Another change in school financing and monitoring would be the establishment of an A to F school grading system. So schools would be given a grade A, B, C, D, F. Looks very similar to a system in the state of Florida, except that this system would give schools grades based on proficiency levels, not growth. So the percent of students who score at or above proficient on end of grade on the annual assessments would determine the school's grade, not the student's growth. The student's growth would be reported in an annual report card, but the actual grade itself would only take into consideration the percent of students who passed. And there are several bills that mention giving school districts maximum flexibility in their use of state funds. So currently, if you look at the bills, there are categories of funds that districts use for certain things, like teachers' assistants, for example. And these bills seek to allow school districts to have maximum flexibility to use these state funds however they would like in order to maximize student achievement. Thank you.
All right, so now that we have a basic understanding of the sweeping implications of these bills, it's time for our panelists to weigh in. So how this is going to work is we're going to have about 8 minutes per question. We'll ask a question, the panel will be free to answer. So our first question is, if these bills are passed, how will teachers and teaching be affected?
Let me start, just back up just a little bit. I think it's really important to understand what the real agenda is of all this.
Can't hear you.
Oh, yeah. You should have told her to shut up. Basically, what we're looking at, not just in North Carolina, but elsewhere in the country, at least in a lot of states, is essentially an assault on the whole concept of public education that's existed and grown up in this country since the mid-19th century. We seem to be debating issues that I thought were put to bed after Horace Mann. The goal of this movement, which is pretty well financed by very conservative foundations like Walton and Broad and Cates, bless his heart, is the basic idea is to replace our public education system with a system of schools. Replace the public education system with a system of sort of freestanding schools. The whole thing is based on selling a myth, namely that schools are broken. Because if you can't convince people that the school system is broken, then you can't have a justification for replacing it. It's a myth because it's not true. North Carolina schools have been, the graduation rates have been going up, test scores have been going up. We're at the middle of the country in terms of test scores, despite the high levels of poverty in the state. And so, but you have to go around saying the system is lousy, the system is lousy, it's broken, it has to be replaced. So that's a PR technique which has been used very effectively. Essentially, if you're replacing a public education system with a publicly funded system of schools, what you're basically doing is replacing the priority of private interests over any sort of coherent collective social interest. You're saying that if, insofar as there is a public interest in taxing people and paying for a public education system, that public interest is really the sum of a lot of private interests. It ignores the basic purposes for which public education is taxed, revenues raised for, and financed to create citizens, to create a workforce. It's a collective, there is a collective good to public education. since the 19th century, and is a given in almost every other country. But so what we basically have at work is two very, very different visions of public education, a private vision and a public vision. And as I said, this is a movement that has its roots well outside North Carolina, although the money, there's a lot of money flowing in. If you don't know ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, learn about it, because this is a group which is going to create model legislation which Republican legislators in lots of states simply take and write into bills. It's essentially, it's not a conservative agenda, it's a very radical, we need to understand this is a radical change. It's radical in the sense that it breaks the connection between schools and public purposes, educated citizenry, workforce, and so forth. It rejects the whole notion of a coherent education system, one that looks to make sure that you're serving all students, not just the privileged. And it leaves virtually no rooms for principles of social justice and equity. Yeah, if it's all a question of, all it counts is the private interests of parents picking schools, then where does the public stake in equity and social justice come from? And these are not new issues. Schools have always balanced public and private interests. There's always been competition between them. But what's happening is it's getting skewed now by the kind of debate we're having. Let me just end with a quote from John Dewey. He said, "What the best and wisest parent wants for his child, that we must want for all the children of the community. And anything less is unlovely and left unchecked destroys our democracy." I think it's important to learn what's really at stake with this.
I'd like to pick up from there too, and not answer the question. Exact question, right. So we'll be both rogues together, because the main thing that I wanted to talk about is exactly what you began to talk about. And a friend of mine said the other day, how could it be that just 10, 20 years ago, it would be unthinkable to think about public funds going into non-public, ersatz public schools. And how could it be thinkable that there would be subcontractors, subcontracting bits and pieces of what is the education business and everything that goes in behind it, whether it's facilities or teachers. So then I discovered this ALEC that you're talking about. And it's not new. 1973, Heritage Foundation, founder is behind it. 73 was about Reagan era, yes. And some of the people you're referring to are the Koch brothers, Owen, Brode, Bradley, and interestingly, you have to be a member. You can be a member of it, but if you're a corporation, you pay $25,000 membership per year. If you're a legislator, you pay $50 a year. Interesting, and it is a kind of a partnership. And as was said, they create model legislation, and it's just right there and ready for people who come to the conventions and all to say, I'll take that. And so it's becoming something of a governance, non-government governance process, and it avoids, it calls itself not a lobby, and so it does not have to be transparent. It does not have to pay taxes. One of my big messages is, are we having another kind of level of governance, a kind of governance that's going on that we're not even noticing, while we focus on the specifics of the legislation that's going through. And a couple of things that I discovered in doing some research is, well, let me just shift to thinking about who benefits. The critical theorists always ask who benefits and who loses. And some of the people I would think who benefit from some of these the directions of this legislation. Tutoring companies, Sylvan, Kaplan, Scantron, Dell, K through 1 Incorporated, Connections Incorporated, lots of businesses that are ready to provide internet education. And so if through this legislation a school is said to get an F, where are the kids going? This kind of legislation sets it up for businesses to be the takeovers. And one of our leadership students is actually teaching not teaching, he's an administrator in Washington, D.C. And he says that they're basically closing down the southern part of Washington, D.C. and selling the property to businesses who will now set up the business of schools. I don't know much more than what he just told me, but definitely something to watch. And I have a lot more to say, particularly about Alec's strategies. They're clever and interesting, but I think I should let somebody else talk first and not answer the question.
I can try to answer the question. I grew up in North Carolina. So I started out in the state as a young man in the dark. Really, because we had a very poor system of public education in North Carolina. So I've experienced watching the state come from a yearly battle of who was going to be on bottom, Mississippi, North Carolina. In many years it was us, both the teacher pay and education requirements. Okay, so I have experienced that, and I've also experienced the opportunity to see and be a part of what it takes to actually move the dial. And it required a social contract between the people and its government, and actually the business and corporate community, and in the educational system of which this university is a mighty part of. Prepare those teachers, this university well prepared to go make the difference out there in the schools. And then for the schools and for the public to maintain a support structure for those teachers to develop over time, assuming that not all knowledge is known on the day of graduation, not all skills have been learned, that you can actually learn something post-graduation. And indeed, knowledge continues to grow and change because these professors are helping create new knowledge bases all across this campus or about that campus and across other campuses. So the social contract was in place to help build the state quality. So as Ted and Catherine have mentioned, there is a privatization afoot. Now it is actually, I wish I could confront and say, no, it's not part of the Experience Lawyer Plan. Unfortunately, it is. Now, I first became aware of that actually when I left North Carolina in my post-retirement years from the university to become vice president of an organization called the Education Commission of the States, which is in Denver, Colorado. It was established, by the way, in part by Governor Terry Sanford of the state at the end of his work, realizing that really at that point in time when Johnson was creating the Great Society, the states were not organized to actually act in ways and learn from each other. And so they set up a commission of the states to learn from each other. Now in that role, in that organization out in Denver, our job was, and it still is, to track all educational policy in America. You can write your dissertation off the work that's inside of that organization. It's an amazing place for collecting educational policy data. We had as our leaders alternatives between Republican governor and Democratic governor, Republican governor, Democratic governor. So walking in, Sebelius was in charge. The next person was Mike Huckabee, who, when he was in that role, I would have voted for the man because of what he was doing in the state of Arkansas, which was pushing back against the Southern Baptists who wanted to take money from the state to pay for the church schools in the state of who was trying to consolidate the system and improve teacher quality in that state. It's only when these guys run for president that I saw a new person show up with. But that aside, but in tracking the policies, we began to see a pattern emerge. And that was the policies being written independently in the states and coming forward to the education of the state, mission of the states for us to catalog, began to look old. That is, they were written centuries and being adopted in other parts of the United States. So it was shocking to see that we really weren't making policies. We were adopting policies along the line of ideology. Now, it was mentioned that Florida has been mentioned as one of the places. That's because the former Governor Jeb Bush is running a foundation for excellence in education and achieving changes and being funded by some of the operatives that you have heard here today. So I hate to divest you of your innocence. But there is a political war underway in our country for the minds and hearts of public education in America. It's very well funded, as we said, and it will affect North Carolina in some very significant ways. And those ways we are already seeing underfoot. We have just finished a report that will be released tomorrow on STEM education in the state. Harold Guillory on this campus and John Materno produced a great report on where is North Carolina now and where is it going. Where it's going, by the way, the very demographic that's being negatively affected by these policies is the growing demographic in North Carolina. It is the demographic that if we do not educate to high standards, has negative consequences for every single person in the room and all your begattees in the future. Okay. So as a grandfather now, I have a sense of urgency about this. It's a street game for me. And it's information that you should pay attention to, and I'm certainly paying attention to, and I will be politically engaged around acting on some of those actions. We cannot fire our way to excellence in education in North Carolina. We cannot test our way to excellence in North Carolina. While we need to fire some people and we need to test everybody, that's not the strategy for moving forward in the state of North Carolina. We have seen that strategy. That strategy investing in the human capacity of the teachers, the principals, the counselors, the librarians, and others who are leading our schools in this state. So efforts to bring down those systems. Sadly, outside of that door right there, there's a wonderful out-of-date sign about the North Carolina College program. It's completely insane to have brought that program down, given the data we have. And to replace it with, and I love Teach for America. I brought it to Eastern North Carolina because I couldn't get a physics teacher to go to Berkeley campus, so I helped get them. But that is not a strategy for improving teacher education and education in the state when they occupy 0.4% of the teaching population, and the university reduced 36,000 of those teachers out there teaching right now in my graduate university system. And we have evidence that they're doing quite well for the majority. So the consequences for North Carolina are draconian. And as a North Carolinian, I'm upset about it. I'm upset because I'm not going to let a group of people with an ideological bent, axe to grind, to take down a state that has worked so hard to get itself at least to the middle of the pack. We got a long way to go. We're just in the middle of the pack, and we got to move it forward. So I think knowing what's really afoot, being actively, politically, continue your good education and fight the good fight is what's called for. To move, to, at least ameliorate some of the implications for education which are underway right now. And I need to say, just as a little sidebar on charter schools, we have somehow shot ourselves in the foot, I think, in the education community over that. We had the great opportunity when charter schools were being established in the state, for the universities, and I was part of that system, that rebuked the opportunity to actually work and establish some charter schools. To look and study centers of innovation, see how we can learn from that and change what we're doing. Instead, we put it off. Well, that has come full circle. idea of setting up a separate education system for charters, a separate system for public schools, the path is clear. This will become more white and privileged, and this will become poor and disenfranchised. And the future of North Carolina lies in those schools, my friends, and we better pay attention to it. So that's my speech, and I'm sticking with it.
I think to think about what it means for you as either practicing teachers or preparing teachers, it means several things. And it means them in a package, and it means them separately. So it means that you may never qualify for tenure, which means a kind of security or stability in your job status. When this happened in Florida, and it did, 2011, teachers worried and are apparently having problems securing home loans because they can't demonstrate that they have, in fact, a job beyond 9 months out. I think it's important to have levers to get rid of or otherwise rehabilitate teachers who really need extra help, but I don't think it's to take the rug out from under them entirely. So that's what it would mean for you. It would also mean, by the way, that possibly in the era of no post-secondary education, illegal aliens, that the many children that all of you have in your classes right now who are undocumented may no longer have the incentive to work as hard as they are to breach that divide. They're working hard in order to take a family, take their own family and their own futures to the next level. And what if you cannot access the post-secondary system? Even if you've gained admission on your own merit, and even if you can self-pay, you may not step foot in one of these classrooms that all of you now have the privilege of sitting in. I think that matters for a K-12 teacher, because how are you going to motivate those kids? How are you going to do it? Pay for performance, or in this bill it's called pay for excellence. You know, I feel strongly that we should be thinking about how to hold teachers accountable for their student success. But not only teachers, but the whole of society. The challenge with holding teachers for the success of their students is that we don't yet have it right. The value-added model systems are inaccurate, inflexible, and inefficient. Those who work on them day in and day out say that they have no signal. That is, there's no signal in the data to hold an individual teacher accountable for a classroom of students learning. So what do we do, for example, with teachers who teach PE and social studies, for example? There are a host of technical issues that I think Dr. Houck can speak to. And I think what Allison mentioned with regard to the school grades also has implications for the teachers, you practicing teachers, and those who are becoming teachers in the state, because your school will be graded A through F on the basis of what we call absolute scores. And this, by the way, even though it's said to be modeled on Florida, does not have one of the critical components of the Florida framework, which is to incentivize schools to increase the growth of their students. It's an absolute score, so it says basically you'll get points for every proportion, for all proportions of children in the school who have attained proficiency on the state exam. It doesn't say if you take Jill and you move her from a level 1 to a level 3 that you will get rewarded. And the real implications are that the incentives aren't there to focus on the kids who need to move, and frankly, to focus on the kids who have attained proficiency. If they've attained proficiency, you're not paying attention to them anymore, then you don't have any incentive to continue to move them up. So it's potentially problematic for the whole performance band, if you will. And the problem, and this is the problem that concerns me the most, frankly, is that we know, all of us know as educational researchers, that the thing that matters for students' own learning is a good teacher, and good teaching, and a bond with that teacher. And if you, good teachers, can teach in an F school or you can teach in an A school, even though you're committed social justarians, I just made up that word, it will be very difficult for you to stay in an F school because you will be beat up under an accountability system. So those are some of the implications I see for teachers and teaching.
I guess everybody's spoken with me. That's
Rare.
unfortunate. There's been a lot that's been put out here for us to think about. I think if there was anything that I could contribute, and there's probably not a lot as far as opening statements are concerned, I think one of the things that would, although it's not the exciting part of all of this, is to ask some serious questions about governance. Because one of the things that we see with all these bills coming out, and Ted and I were talking before, not just about content, but about strategy. And so what you're sort of seeing politically is a host of legislation kind of coming at us really quickly, right? It's kind of a shotgun approach. I don't mean to use a martial metaphor.
Shock and awe.
Shock and awe is a better military metaphor. But keeping our heads about us and thinking carefully about how is it that we want to be governed and are supposed to be governed, right? So political scientists back in the 1970s looked across all the states and determined what's their political culture? How do they run themselves? And one of the things he came up with is the notion that particularly southern states, and we live in one of those, right, has what he called a paternalistic political culture. That is, there's a lot of power centralized at the state level. If you've come here from any other state, if you've come here from Michigan, right, maybe Ohio, you've come from a culture where local districts had a lot of autonomy to do things on behalf of schools, teachers, and kids, right? Or even as a principal, you had funds at your disposal that you were able to leverage to do what you thought was appropriate in the pursuit of educational goals. And that's never really been the case here in North Carolina, right? When the kind of joke is when we say states' rights, we really mean the state, right? And we don't mean roll it down to the county commissioners or let the mayors handle it. It's a lot of power consolidated in the state. And what you see is a real schizophrenia among these bills about trying to answer that question of who's in charge. And one of the things that I'm concerned about as someone who teaches educational leaders is the capacity of our educational leaders to make decisions were this entire framework to go through. That's not to say that our leaders are incapable. It's just to say that they're not trained to work in a system where the money that they have to spend at the school level is all of a sudden unloosed, right? And they have to make manifold strategic decisions. Our political culture has grown up in such a way that money comes to schools and districts from the state in fairly strict sort of pots of money. And that reflects state priorities. And so making these kinds of transitions in governance, passing a bill is one thing, but the thoughtful work of actually making a transition plan so that you don't leave school leaders sort of unprepared to handle a budgetary situation that they've never experienced before. And the consequences that would have for teachers and kids, it might not be talking about ALEC, but it's important work to think about, how we want to kind of structure this. And that does concern me because you see a lot of different types of language coming out. On the one hand, we're going to loosen up and funding flexibility, and administrators are going to be confronted with money and kind of no sense of priority of how to spend it. On the other hand, one of the bills not mentioned here is the state wants to redraw the school board districts for the Wake County public school system, right? So is it state control? Is it local control? How do we do this? And the last thing I would say as far as a touchstone, also as a native North Carolinian, is we had a really important court case here in 1997, Leandro versus the state of North Carolina, that focused on these issues of school funding and working to support disadvantaged students. And one of the things that states will often say, and this happened when I worked in Georgia too, when confronted with these kinds of lawsuits, is, you know, it's not us, it's the local districts. You know, the state's working fine. It's those local school boards. They're a bunch of yahoos. They don't know what they're doing. And it's a dodge, right? Because what Leandro told us in 1997 and remains constitutionally true to today is that the function of supporting high-quality public education resides with the state. It's the state's responsibility. And local boards of education are constructions of the state. They exist because the state allows them to exist. And so to introduce a raft of legislation that throws funding down to the local districts feels very uncomfortable, because it feels like it might be a prelude to, well, you know, we did everything we could. It's those local district people who didn't really understand how to spend the money and help kids, right? So just thinking about the implications for governance, maybe going back to some of our constitutional language, and thinking carefully about what this says about who's in charge of what and why, and by what authority, I think might get us down the road towards having a foundation for answering some of these questions. How's that motion?
Great. Well, thank you guys so much. Now we have a little bit of time left, so we'd like to open the floor for questions from the audience.
So I'm a practicing teacher in Orange County, so I teach first grade. What do we do other than come and hear you all talk and agree with you and commiserate and, you know, like, what do I do now?
Well, you know what my answer to that is. That is, I think, somebody told me in this very room one time, education equals politics. I didn't understand what they meant at that time. I don't know that I really understand it now, but I do understand that I can't just expect somebody else to do something for me. So I think what that means for you, first grade teacher, thank you by the way, is to also become involved with your other teachers, or write your legislators, give them stories. I used to go to the General Assembly every Friday to deal with the Education Oversight Committee. A bad day at the General Assembly was me trying to convince them what a great job the university can do. A good day in the General Assembly was finding a teacher and having them tell their story in their General Assembly. You have a lot of power that you don't know you have. I would say just find your own voice, speak it or write it, and start doing that. I say that to everybody.
I just want to jump in because I actually teach a class at 5 on education policy, and I have to actually go earn my keep. I'm sorry that I have to say this in a walk. I'd love to hear people's reaction, but I think one of the other things that gets lost in some of the discussion about the politics of this is have a yes, don't just have a no. Right? I think part of the reason that these arguments that have been articulated have salience and gain traction is because, you know, they stick on a kernel of something that's actually going on, right? So yeah, our schools are doing well, but we do have a minority achievement gap, and we do not do well as we could with low-income kids, right? That's not true. But then folks are using that as a purchase point to generate legislation that you may not agree with. I think it's really appropriate to not agree with the legislation, but I think at some point in the conversation, you advantage yourself, just intellectually, you advantage the community by having an answer to the question, right? What would you do to close minority achievement, right? Would you like to see more teachers' assistants? Would you like to see different staffing ratios, right? And I think just going through that process of having a yes when you do go to the General Assembly and somebody asks you that question, you know, feel free to articulate your no, but I think it's always just nice to have a yes. And that's something active that you can engage yourself in, and your community in dialogue. Right. So if you're an undergraduate in EDUC 506, you are dismissed from this.
Okay, so I work for a political organization. One of the things we advocate for is strong public schools. But what he has just said is very true in that when we criticize these proposals, we are told, oh, you're just protecting the status quo. You don't have any positive vision of your own. And we're not going to get that positive vision from the political arena. I've been trying for years to get people to articulate whether or not. That's going to have to come from the academic sector. Come up with something different. But my question to you is this. I heard Diane Ravitch 2 weeks ago say that virtually every idea being proposed is a failed idea. It has either been rejected by other states or tried in other states and has failed. Studies have proved teachers aren't motivated by money, so merit pay doesn't work. Charter and voucher schools do not achieve higher scores, even though they're cherry-picking students, and on and on. So it's a very powerful argument to say they are proposing nothing but failed ideas for North Carolina. But is it a true idea? I'd really like to know if you agree with that statement or if you think it's an exaggeration.
So I'll pick up on the pay for excellence or pay for performance piece. We have the best study on pay for performance of teachers coming out of Vanderbilt and the National Center for Performance Incentives. It's called Pilot. And this study spent 3 years trying to incentivize teachers with up to $15,000 a year extra if they were going to rate by just incentives alone to raise their students' test scores. And they didn't tell them how to do it because this legislation doesn't, and these legislative patterns that we see across the country says we're going to give all the flexibility in the world to teachers to figure out how to improve their student performance, which basically means we don't know, right? But all we're going to do is incentivize them up to $15,000 extra a year. This is what they found. Teachers randomly assigned to the treatment group, those who were eligible for bonuses, did not outperform students whose teachers were assigned to the control group, not eligible for bonuses. So this is a randomized controlled trial, very large, in a large urban metropolitan district, the gold standard of educational research, found no effect of $15,000 pay for performance bonus. So I can speak to that, and others have charters or school grades.
To answer your narrow question, Diane's right. These systems that are these solutions that are proposed do not work. Charters, for example, there's no evidence of performance works. Charters, the best research, the Stanford research shows that about half of charters are about the same in terms of academic regular public schools. Of the other half, there are twice as many charters that are worse than that are better. So 1 out of 6 charter schools is worse than the replacing. I tend to, when I deal with this question, and my wife and I had an op-ed in the New York Times about a year and a half ago on the relationship between poverty and achievement. Nobody disputes the fact that there's a correlation between socioeconomic status or poverty and achievement. Everybody, the data is just too overwhelming. So everybody, the question is, how do you respond to this correlation? One thing, the ideally, is sort of get rid of poverty, but that which we try with the Great Society program. So that's probably not in the political cards right now. The second thing is you can just ignore the correlation. So when they're proposing legislation to grade schools on the basis of the result, not on the improvement, they're basically saying, yeah, we're going to ignore the relation. We're going to simply expect every teacher to get every kid into high level no matter what. This is the No Child Left Behind, and Obama's just as bad as Bush on it. So the second one is simply ignore the problem and talk about it. The third thing is not to try to eliminate poverty per se, but to try to address the particular challenges that poor kids bring with them when they enter the school. That is to say, that address the points at which poverty impacts on education. And that's a more manageable thing. And there's real low-hanging fruit on this, like health clinics in schools, early childhood education. If you want to get down to the kind of issues you're dealing with in charter schools, transportation and nutrition issues, I mean, there are ways in which you can say, poor kids bring challenges with them that middle-class kids don't. Let's try to focus on them. And I think as a general strategy for community education in these kids, that's a useful way to do it.
Thank you so much. We are just about out of time, and I think there's a class in here next. So we should probably head up. Quickly though, what can you do? Spread awareness. So now that we know about these bills and what a lot of implications are, tell everyone you know, right? There's a lot at stake here. Stay aware. Track education bills in the legislature. You can go to ncleg.net. You can attend legislative meetings. And as Dr. Cobble said, advocate, right? We're all residents of North Carolina. We have a right to have a voice, so advocate whatever you can. So thank you so much to our panelists.